On a freezing winter morning in Northbridge, a young woman was out on the sidewalk, shoveling snow just to afford another day of survival. Her hands were numb, her breath turning into white mist, and beside her, a tiny stray puppy trembled from the cold. Her only friend in a world that never seemed to choose her. She thought the worst part of her day would be the temperature, until a group of wealthy kids rolled up, laughing at her, mocking her clothes, and raising a heavy snow shovel towards the helpless puppy just to see her break. She had no protection, no voice, and no one willing to step in. The street was silent. The people looked away. The cruelty kept coming. And just when she braced herself for the blow she couldn't stop, a shadow emerged through the swirling snow. Broad shoulders, a military coat, and a German shepherd by his side. A U.S. veteran, battle-hardened and silent, stepped between her and the danger without a word. In that single instant, the game changed, and the bullies realized they had picked the wrong girl, on the wrong day, in front of the wrong man. Northbridge was the kind of town that looked beautiful only from far away. From a distance, its rooftops were powdered in white, chimneys bleeding warm smoke into the frozen air, storefront windows shimmering with frost like tiny mirrors of winter magic. But up close, the truth was less poetic. Northbridge was a place where the cold crept into bones, where wind carved through alleyways like invisible blades, and where those who worked outdoors met the kind of suffering no postcard ever showed. That morning, a brutal cold front had settled across the town, turning each breath into a ghostly cloud and every sidewalk into a slab of ice. The temperature had sunk to the point where metal burned skin, and the snow behaved more like sandpaper than the fluffy kind children dream about. Even seasoned residents stayed inside, doors tightly shut, heaters humming. Only one person was out working. A young woman bent over a shovel, fighting the storm like a lone figure in a battlefield of white. Her name was Hannah Ruiz, 23 years old, slender with a wiry resilience that came only from years of being forced to endure. Her frame was almost fragile beneath her oversized gray winter coat, but her arms showed a quiet strength from countless mornings spent shoveling snow for minimum wage. She had long, dark brown hair tied back beneath a knitted beanie, a few damp strands glued to her cheek by the cold. Her skin was light olive, flushed pink from the harsh wind, and her eyes, warm brown, soft yet wary, held the kind of exhaustion that didn't come from physical work alone, but from life itself. She had learned to keep her head down around people, to stay invisible whenever possible, because invisibility was safer than confrontation. Hannah dragged her shovel forward, scraping the frozen sidewalk behind McCarthy's drugstore. She worked systematically, clearing a path no one would thank her for, but everyone would use without thinking. Her breath formed small clouds that vanished into the air almost as quickly as they appeared. She paused only when a tiny movement under a nearby bench caught her attention. A small gray and white puppy, no more than 3 months old, peeked out from the shadows, eyes wide and shimmering like dark glass. The pup had a narrow face, oversized paws, and a thin coat matted with clumps of frozen snow. His ribs were faintly visible, and his tail tucked nervously between his legs. Hannah had found him wandering alone a week ago, and had quietly slipped him bits of her lunch since then. She never named him properly, but she sometimes whispered "Snowy" under her breath, the closest thing to affection she dared to give. Snowy whined softly, a fragile sound nearly swallowed by the wind. Hannah crouched down, brushing snow off his tiny back. "Hang in there, little guy," she murmured, her voice hoarse from the cold. "Just a bit longer. I'll get you something warm later." The puppy leaned into her glove, shivering. She didn't have a heater, nor a stable place to keep him, but at least she could try to keep him alive. Snowy was the only creature who didn't look at her like she was a nuisance or a burden. Northbridge, however, had a social hierarchy as harsh as its winter. And that was when the crunch of footsteps on ice signaled trouble. Blake Sterling turned the corner with the easy swagger of someone who had never worked a day in his life. At 20 years old, Blake had the kind of polished good looks that came from expensive haircuts and good genetics. Tall, broad-shouldered, blonde hair slicked back under a branded winter beanie, jawline sharp enough to suggest confidence, yet softened by the lifetime of privilege behind it. His pale blue eyes were cold and amused, eyes that had seen everything handed to him and had never once needed to lift anything heavier than a golf club. His father, Richard Sterling, was a wealthy real estate mogul and current mayoral candidate, and Blake carried that power like armor. He had 3 friends trailing behind him, 2 boys in equally expensive winter jackets, and 1 girl with a designer scarf wrapped stylishly around her neck. They were all well-fed, well-dressed, and utterly unaware of the kind of struggles that shaped people like Hannah. "Look what we have here," Blake smirked, kicking a pile of snow toward Hannah. The dirty slush splattered across her boots and coat. "Northbridge's little snowmaid, hard at work like a good peasant." One of his friends snickered. The girl, twirling her scarf, offered a fake sympathetic pout. "Oh, Blake, be nice. She's just trying to do her job." But her tone had no warmth, only amusement. Hannah stiffened but said nothing. Silence had always been her shield. Blake walked closer, boots crunching sharply. His attention drifted to the small shape cowering under the bench. "What's that?" he asked. "A rat?" Snowy whimpered, backing deeper into the shadows. "It's a puppy," Hannah said quietly, stepping slightly in front of him. "He's cold and—" Blake cut her off with a laugh. "You feeding strays now? That's cute. Maybe you should ask my dad to adopt you too." The boys behind him howled with laughter. Hannah swallowed the burn of humiliation. She'd been mocked before, but the sight of Blake leaning down toward Snowy triggered a tightening in her chest. "I bet this little mutt bites," Blake said, reaching for a discarded chunk of frozen snow. His grin sharpened. "Maybe we should test that." "Please don't," Hannah said, her voice finally cracking with fear. Blake stood back up, snow chunk in hand, and aimed it at the trembling puppy. "Relax, it's just a joke." It wasn't a joke. Hannah could see the cruelty in his eyes, the casual kind that didn't even need a reason. She moved forward quickly, blocking his line of sight. "Don't touch him." Blake raised an eyebrow, surprised she'd found the courage to speak. "Or, what?" he asked, stepping closer, towering over her. "You gonna hit me with your little shovel?" His friends snickered again, the sound sharp and cold. Snowy barked once, a tiny, frightened sound. Blake's expression twisted with irritation. "Shut up, rat." He stepped around Hannah and lifted his boot as if preparing to kick the puppy. Hannah lunged forward, grabbing his sleeve. "Stop!" Blake whipped his arm away, face reddening with anger. "You don't get to tell me what to do." He reached down, grabbed a chunk of ice, and lifted it like a weapon. Snowy yelped, curling in on himself, and Hannah, breath trembling, stepped directly in front of him, arms spread wide, not for herself, but for the tiny, helpless creature behind her. For a moment, the world was silent but for the biting wind, the falling snow, the thumping of Hannah's terrified heart. Blake sneered dangerously. "Move." Hannah didn't, and that was the moment, the exact second, when everything that would follow began. When a bully raised his hand, when a girl refused to back down, when a small, shivering life hung in the balance. And out on the far end of the sidewalk, though none of them noticed yet, a tall man in a dark military parka and a German shepherd with amber eyes had just turned the corner, watching everything. Everything that should not have happened in a town buried in winter. Everything that was about to change. The moment Blake raised the block of ice, the world seemed to contract into a single heartbeat. The wind screamed through the alley, snowflakes slashed sideways, and Hannah Ruiz stood frozen between danger and a trembling puppy. Her thin frame bracing for impact, she knew she couldn't stop. But before Blake's arm could swing downward, another sound cut through the storm. A deep, commanding bark that echoed against the brick walls like a warning shot. All heads snapped toward the far end of the sidewalk. A tall man in a heavy military cold-weather parka strode forward, each step sinking into the snow with unwavering weight. Jim Walker, around 50, carried the kind of presence that made people instinctively move aside. His face was weathered, marked by years of service and the harshness of places far colder than Northbridge. He had a square jaw dusted with salt and pepper stubble, a nose slightly crooked from an old break, and deep-set blue eyes that scanned danger with surgical precision. Jim wasn't bulky, but his build was compact and powerful, muscle earned through repetition, discipline, and survival. The veteran moved with the silent confidence of a man who had seen cruelty before and refused to look away from it again. Beside him padded Rex, a massive 4-year-old German shepherd with a sable coat of black and tan, broad chest, and intelligent amber eyes that gleamed with alertness. Snow clung to his fur as he stalked forward, posture rigid, tail straight, muscles tight under his thick winter coat. Rex wasn't growling yet, but the tension in his shoulders warned that one wrong move would unleash a storm worse than the blizzard. Blake Sterling faltered for the first time, lowering the ice chunk a few inches as the giant dog approached. "Who the hell—" He didn't finish the sentence. Jim closed the distance in seconds, his steps measured, his gaze unblinking. The storm whipped around him, snow stinging his face, but he did not slow. When he reached the scene, he didn't raise his voice, didn't posture, didn't explain. He simply stepped between Hannah and the danger, body turned slightly sideways, one hand lowered toward Rex in silent command. Rex responded instantly, standing at Jim's left flank, ears forward, gaze locked onto Blake. Then Blake did something stupid. His pride outweighed his instinct for self-preservation. Embarrassed that someone had dared interrupt him, he lifted the block of ice again and barked, "Back off, old man. This doesn't concern you." Jim's hand shot up with the speed of a striking hawk. He caught Blake's wrist mid-swing, fingers clamping so tightly that Blake's knuckles whitened. The block of ice slipped from Blake's grip and shattered against the pavement. "It concerns me now," Jim said, his voice low and calm like distant thunder. His tone contained no anger, only a simple truth that made the rich kid blanch. Trying to yank his arm free, Blake discovered Jim's strength wasn't merely physical, it was absolute. Years of battlefield training turned Jim's grip into iron. With a single twist, Jim forced Blake to stumble backward, releasing him just before the boy could fall. "Walk away," Jim said, "before you do something you can't take back." Blake's face burned red beneath the icy wind. Humiliation warred with fear. He opened his mouth, but Rex took one slow step forward, lowering his head, issuing a deep rumble that vibrated against the concrete. The other rich boys flinched. The girl in the designer scarf clutched her phone, speechless. But Blake Sterling had never walked away from anything in his privileged life, and he wasn't about to start now. He lunged toward the snow shovel lying nearby. It was a standard aluminum scoop used by town workers, heavy and slick with frost. Blake grabbed the handle, lifted it over his head, and swung with blind fury. Jim didn't evade. He intercepted. His hand reached out, fingers closing around the handle mid-air. The metal vibrated violently as both men grappled for control, but Jim held firm. His boots were planted solidly in the snow, his stance balanced, his body unmoving despite the force of the attack. Then, with a motion so smooth it almost seemed effortless, Jim twisted the shovel from Blake's grip, snapped the handle across his knee, and tossed the broken pieces to the ground. The sound echoed like a gunshot. Rex barked once, sharp and commanding. Hannah, still shielding Snowy with her trembling hands, stared wide-eyed at the veteran who had appeared like a guardian carved from winter itself. She had never been defended, never been protected, never felt someone step into danger on her behalf. Her breath caught in her throat, forming a trembling white cloud. Blake staggered back. You can't do that! Do you even know who I am?" Jim finally turned fully toward him, eyes steady. "I don't care who you are." The simple sentence cut deeper than any threat. But help for Blake came from an unexpected angle. A squat man in a neon safety jacket hurried across the snowy lot, red-faced and wheezing. Harold Clarkson, the sanitation supervisor for Northbridge, was in his mid-50s, with thinning hair plastered to his forehead with sweat despite the cold. His round face was flushed, and his small eyes darted anxiously between Blake and Jim. Clarkson was known in town for two things: avoiding responsibility and bowing to anyone with money. His ill-fitting jacket strained around his belly, and his clipboard was clutched like a shield. "What's going on here?" Clarkson puffed. "Blake, are you hurt? Did this worker cause trouble?" Hannah's stomach dropped. Of all people, Clarkson was the last she wanted to see. He never sided with anyone he couldn't benefit from. Blake straightened, realizing an opportunity. "She let a stray animal onto city property, and it attacked me." He lied effortlessly. "She's unstable, and—" "This man assaulted me!" Jim's jaw tightened, but he said nothing yet. Clarkson turned on Hannah with exaggerated disgust. "A stray? Ruiz, are you out of your mind? We have policies, strict policies, and you—" He jabbed a finger at Snowy, curled in the snow, violated city safety codes, and endangered a citizen. Hannah's lips parted in disbelief. "Snowy didn't do anything. He's just cold. Blake tried to—" "Enough," Clarkson snapped. "You're suspended, effective immediately. Return your equipment and stay off city property until further notice." The words hit her harder than the cold. Her only income, gone in seconds. Tears welled in her eyes, not from the wind, but from helplessness. Jim stepped forward. "She did nothing wrong." Clarkson turned to him with false bravado. "And you are?" "A witness," Jim said simply. "Well, witness," Clarkson huffed. "Stay out of this before I call the police." Jim's eyes darkened slightly, not with fear but with experience. "Call them." The challenge hung in the air, but Blake wasn't about to let that happen. "No need," he said quickly, fixing his scarf. "I don't want trouble. Let's just go." He didn't want a police report on record, not before his father's election season. Clarkson nodded obediently. "Of course, Blake. I'll take care of this." The rich kids retreated, their laughter fading into the wind. Snowy whimpered as Hannah knelt, scooping the puppy into her coat. She whispered apologies into his fur, though none of this had been her fault. Jim crouched beside her, Rex sitting at perfect heel. "You okay?" Hannah nodded shakily, though the fear in her eyes made the gesture hollow. "Thank you," she whispered, voice breaking. Jim looked at Clarkson's retreating figure, then at the broken shovel, then at the bruising forming on Hannah's cheek from the wind and stress. He exhaled slowly. This isn't right. It wasn't just about a job, or a puppy. It was about a town where power outweighed truth. And Jim Walker, who had spent half his life protecting strangers in distant lands, felt something old and heavy stir inside him, the instinct to stand between harm and the innocent. Rex nudged Hannah's arm gently, as if offering comfort. It was the first small sign that this battle was far from over. The wind had softened by the time Jim Walker led Hannah and the two dogs down Main Street, but the cold still clung to every exposed inch of skin. Snow drifted in lazy spirals from the gray sky, giving the town a muted, dreamlike quality. Storefronts glowed faintly behind fogged windows, their warm lights contrasting sharply with the harsh winter outside. Hannah walked silently beside Jim, clutching Snowy to her chest, the puppy's small heartbeat fluttering against her coat. Rex paced on Jim's left, his disciplined trot showing he was trained to guard a perimeter on the move. Every few steps, Rex glanced toward Snowy with curious sympathy, as if assessing the smaller dog's condition. Jim didn't speak at first. He simply guided them forward with the steady assurance of someone accustomed to taking charge in moments of crisis. Hannah watched him from the corner of her eye, still processing everything that had happened. Jim wasn't loud, wasn't dramatic. He simply reacted. Calm, precise, protective. She had never met someone who stepped into danger so naturally. She kept her scarf tight around her neck, cheeks glowing from cold and lingering fear, long brown hair tucked under her beanie. Her light olive skin looked even paler under the streetlights as exhaustion settled into her features. When they reached the small veterinary clinic near the end of the block, Jim stopped and nodded toward the frosted glass door. "He'll be okay," Jim said, voice low but steady. "Let's get him checked." The clinic was small but charming, the kind that served both townsfolk and the occasional traveler. A wooden sign hung above the door. Northbridge Animal Care, Dr. Tom Halverson. When they stepped inside, warm air enveloped them instantly, carrying the faint smell of antiseptic and pine-scented cleaner. The contrast to the bitter cold outside was almost overwhelming. At the reception desk stood a large man in his early 60s, wiping his hands with a towel. Dr. Tom Halverson, known simply as Dr. Tom, had a stocky build softened with age but still strong from years of lifting animals of all sizes. His beard was thick, white, and neatly trimmed against a broad, kind face. His light blue eyes sparkled behind rectangular glasses, and deep smile lines carved into his cheeks revealed a lifetime of service and compassion. He wore a faded green scrub top under a knitted vest, practical and warm. "Well now," Dr. Tom said, voice gentle yet strong. "That's a puppy that's had a rough morning?" He approached slowly, making sure not to startle Snowy. "Come on in, sweetheart. Let's take a look at you." Hannah loosened her hold and let Dr. Tom carefully take Snowy into his arms. The puppy whimpered softly, but Dr. Tom stroked his head with practiced reassurance. "You poor little thing," he murmured. "Let's get you warm and checked." He motioned them into the exam room. Hannah sat near the edge of a metal stool, clasping, her hands tightly, her breathing shallow. She kept glancing at Snowy every few seconds. Jim stood near the doorway, arms crossed over his parka, Rex lying alert at his feet, ears perked toward the sound of every movement. Dr. Tom examined Snowy thoroughly, checking limbs, joints, heartbeat, temperature. "Mild dislocation in the right foreleg," he said finally. "Nothing serious, no fractures. He must have slipped on the ice or been kicked hard." His voice darkened slightly on the last word. Hannah's eyes lowered. Jim noticed, but didn't comment. "Good news is," Dr. Tom continued, "he'll recover quickly with warmth, rest, and a bit of pain medication. He's tougher than he looks." Relief washed over Hannah so suddenly that her shoulders trembled. She hadn't realized how tightly she'd been holding her breath. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you so much." Dr. Tom smiled kindly. Animals survive the world the same way people do, by holding on to the ones who care about them. He gently bandaged Snowy's leg, wrapped him in a soft blanket, and handed him back to Hannah. Snowy immediately nuzzled into her arms. "How much do I owe you?" she asked, voice small but sincere. Before Dr. Tom could answer, Jim stepped forward and placed his credit card on the counter. "I've got it." Hannah blinked, shaken. "No, you don't have to. It's done," Jim said simply, his tone gentle but firm. "Snowy needed help." "But you don't even know me," she insisted. Jim looked at her then. Really looked. In her tired eyes, he saw someone who had lived too long without anyone taking her side. Someone who had fought quiet battles in the cold long before this morning. "You were protecting a life," Jim said. "That's enough." Dr. Tom nodded approvingly. "He's right. Not many people would shield a trembling puppy from a boy twice their size. That says a lot." Hannah lowered her gaze, embarrassed by the compliment. "I just couldn't let him hurt Snowy." Snowy whimpered softly, and Rex, noticing the sound, stood up and approached with a curious tilt of his head. Rex moved slowly, lowering himself until he sat in front of the smaller dog. Snowy blinked up, nose twitching, then reached forward and gently touched Rex's muzzle with his own. The German Shepherd responded by giving a slow, reassuring lick to the puppy's forehead. Dr. Tom chuckled. "Well, look at that. Seems he's got himself a big brother already." Jim's lips lifted into a rare smile, subtle but warm. "Rex usually doesn't trust easily," he said, "but he likes fighters." Snowy wagged his tail for the first time all morning. Hannah watched the two dogs interact, and something inside her softened, a feeling she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. Safety, even if only for this moment. Dr. Tom continued jotting notes on his chart. "Where's the little one staying? He'll need warmth, proper meals, and a quiet place to rest for a few days." Hannah swallowed hard. "I don't have a place that allows pets, and with me suspended from work." Her voice trailed off, the weight of the situation settling over her again. Jim stepped closer, his expression steady. "He can stay with me and Rex," he said, "until he's recovered. I have space, and the cabin is warm." Hannah's head snapped up. "I couldn't ask you to—" "You're not asking," Jim replied. "I'm offering." Her eyes glistened, but she didn't argue further. Outside, the wind howled again, rattling the clinic's sign. Snow thickened against the window, swirling like white smoke. "You're welcome to visit him any time," Jim added gently. Hannah nodded, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear. She stood awkwardly for a moment, overwhelmed by gratitude she didn't know how to express. "I don't know how to thank you, Jim." "You don't have to," he said. "Just stay warm today. It's only getting colder." Rex nudged Snowy playfully again, and Snowy barked a tiny, squeaky bark in return. His first sign of joy. Hannah let out a small laugh, soft and fragile, the sound of someone remembering happiness. Dr. Tom cleaned the exam table and patted Jim's arm. "You did good bringing him in, and you," he said to Hannah. "Come back if you need anything. My door is always open." Jim opened the clinic door and motioned for Hannah to step through first. Snowy peeked out from her coat, eyes wide at the swirling snow. Rex followed, stepping into formation beside Jim, ever watchful. Hannah looked back at Jim and whispered, "Today felt like the first good thing in a long time." Jim adjusted the collar of his parka, eyes scanning the street out of habit. "Then let's make sure it's not the last." The snow fell heavier now, but somehow the walk back didn't feel as cold but unbroken, kept watch, just as he always had. The wind had softened by the time Jim Walker led Hannah and the two dogs down Main Street, but the cold still clung to every exposed inch of skin. Snow drifted in lazy spirals from the gray sky, giving the town a muted, dreamlike quality. Storefronts glowed faintly behind fogged windows, their warm lights contrasting sharply with the harsh winter outside. Hannah walked silently beside Jim, clutching Snowy to her chest, the puppy's small heartbeat fluttering against her coat. Rex paced on Jim's left, his disciplined trot showing he was trained to guard a perimeter on the move. Every few steps, Rex glanced toward Snowy with curious sympathy, as if assessing the smaller dog's condition. Jim didn't speak at first. He simply guided them forward with the steady assurance of someone accustomed to taking charge in moments of crisis. Hannah watched him from the corner of her eye, still processing everything that had happened. Jim wasn't loud, wasn't dramatic. He simply reacted. Calm, precise, protective. She had never met someone who stepped into danger so naturally. She kept her scarf tight around her neck, cheeks glowing from cold and lingering fear, long brown hair tucked under her beanie. Her light olive skin looked even paler under the streetlights, as exhaustion settled into her features. When they reached the small veterinary clinic near the end of the block, Jim stopped and nodded toward the frosted glass door. "He'll be okay," Jim said, voice low but steady. "Let's get him checked." The clinic was small but charming, the kind that served both townsfolk and the occasional traveler. A wooden sign hung above the door. Northbridge Animal Care, Dr. Tom Halverson. When they stepped inside, warm air enveloped them instantly, carrying the faint smell of antiseptic and pine-scented cleaner. The contrast to the bitter cold outside was almost overwhelming. At the reception desk stood a large man in his early 60s, wiping his hands with a towel. Dr. Tom Halverson, known simply as Dr. Tom, had a stocky build softened with age, but still strong from years of lifting animals of all sizes. His beard was thick, white, and neatly trimmed against a broad, kind face. His light blue eyes sparkled behind rectangular glasses, and deep smile lines carved into his cheeks revealed a lifetime of service and compassion. He wore a faded green scrub top under a knitted vest, practical and warm. "Well now," Dr. Tom said, voice gentle yet strong. "That's a puppy that's had a rough morning." He approached slowly, making sure not to startle Snowy. "Come on in, sweetheart. Let's take a look at you." Hannah loosened her hold and let Dr. Tom carefully take Snowy into his arms. The puppy whimpered softly, but Dr. Tom stroked his head with practiced reassurance. "You poor little thing," he murmured. "Let's get you warm and checked." He motioned them into the exam room. Hannah sat near the edge of a metal stool, clasping, her hands tightly, her breathing shallow. She kept glancing at Snowy every few seconds. Jim stood near the doorway, arms crossed over his parka, Rex lying alert at his feet, ears perked toward the sound of every movement. Dr. Tom examined Snowy thoroughly, checking limbs, joints, heartbeat, temperature. "Mild dislocation in the right foreleg," he said finally. "Nothing serious, no fractures. He must have slipped on the ice or been kicked hard." His voice darkened slightly on the last word. Hannah's eyes lowered. Jim noticed, but didn't comment. "Good news is," Dr. Tom continued, "he'll recover quickly with warmth, rest, and a bit of pain medication. He's tougher than he looks." Relief washed over Hannah so suddenly that her shoulders trembled. She hadn't realized how tightly she'd been holding her breath. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you so much." Dr. Tom smiled kindly. Animals survive the world the same way people do, by holding on to the ones who care about them. He gently bandaged Snowy's leg, wrapped him in a soft blanket, and handed him back to Hannah. Snowy immediately nuzzled into her arms. "How much do I owe you?" she asked, voice small but sincere. Before Dr. Tom could answer, Jim stepped forward and placed his credit card on the counter. "I've got it." Hannah blinked, shaken. "No, you don't have to." "It's done," Jim said simply, his tone gentle but firm. "Snowy needed help." "But you don't even know me," she insisted. Jim looked at her then. Really looked. In her tired eyes, he saw someone who had lived too long without anyone taking her side. Someone who had fought quiet battles in the cold long before this morning. "You were protecting a life," Jim said. "That's enough." Dr. Tom nodded approvingly. "He's right. Not many people would shield a trembling puppy from a boy twice their size. That says a lot." Hannah lowered her gaze, embarrassed by the compliment. "I just couldn't let him hurt Snowy." Snowy whimpered softly, and Rex, noticing the sound, stood up and approached with a curious tilt of his head. Rex moved slowly, lowering himself until he sat in front of the smaller dog. Snowy blinked up, nose twitching, then reached forward and gently touched Rex's muzzle with his own. The German Shepherd responded by giving a slow, reassuring lick to the puppy's forehead. Dr. Tom chuckled. "Well, look at that. Seems he's got himself a big brother already." Jim's lips lifted into a rare smile, subtle but warm. "Rex usually doesn't trust easily," he said, "but he likes fighters." Snowy wagged his tail for the first time all morning. Hannah watched the two dogs interact, and something inside her softened, a feeling she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. Safety, even if only for this moment. Dr. Tom continued jotting notes on his chart. "Where's the little one staying? He'll need warmth, proper meals, and a quiet place to rest for a few days." Hannah swallowed hard. "I don't have a place that allows pets, and with me suspended from work." Her voice trailed off, the weight of the situation settling over her again. Jim stepped closer, his expression steady. "He can stay with me and Rex," he said, "until he's recovered. I have space, and the cabin is warm." Hannah's head snapped up. "I couldn't ask you to—" "You're not asking," Jim replied. "I'm offering." Her eyes glistened, but she didn't argue further. Outside, the wind howled again, rattling the clinic's sign. Snow thickened against the window, swirling like white smoke. "You're welcome to visit him anytime," Jim added gently. Hannah nodded, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear. She stood awkwardly for a moment, overwhelmed by gratitude she didn't know how to express. "I don't know how to thank you, Jim." "You don't have to," he said. "Just stay warm today. It's only getting colder." Rex nudged Snowy playfully again, and Snowy barked a tiny, squeaky bark in return, his first sign of joy. Hannah let out a small laugh, soft and fragile, the sound of someone remembering happiness. Dr. Tom cleaned the exam table and patted Jim's arm. "You did good bringing him in. And you," he said to Hannah, "come back if you need anything. My door is always open." Jim opened the clinic door and motioned for Hannah to step through first. Snowy peeked out from her coat, eyes wide at the swirling snow. Rex followed, stepping into formation beside Jim, ever watchful. Hannah looked back at Jim and whispered, "Today felt like the first good thing in a long time." Jim adjusted the collar of his parka, eyes scanning the street out of habit. "Then let's make sure it's not the last." The snow fell heavier now, but somehow the walk back didn't feel as cold but unbroken, kept watch, just as he always had. The storm deepened over Northbridge's mountains through the night, covering the forest in a heavy blanket of white. Dawn arrived reluctantly, a muted gray glow struggling through thick clouds. Jim Walker woke before sunrise, as he always did. Habit, or maybe instinct. 50 years old, with a face carved by desert winds and cold winters, Jim moved quietly through the cabin, his footsteps silent despite the wooden floor. He glanced toward the living area where Hannah Ruiz slept curled on the couch, wrapped in a thick wool blanket. Her dark chestnut hair spilled across the pillow, and exhaustion softened the sharp lines stress had etched into her young face. Snowy, the 3-month-old gray-white puppy, lay tucked against her stomach. Rex, the 4-year-old German shepherd, stood guard beside them, his large frame relaxed, but his ears constantly twitching at the sounds outside. Jim poured himself a black coffee and stepped outside, letting the cold morning air burn his lungs. The forest was eerily still. He scanned the tree line, eyes narrowing. No movement, no tracks except those from last night. But Jim knew that didn't mean they were safe. The Sterlings had planted a tracker on his Jeep. That was not intimidation. That was recon. Surveillance precedes action. He had been on too many missions not to recognize the pattern. When the sun finally broke through the trees, Hannah woke with a start. For a moment the fear from last night returned, being kicked out, the danger looming, the uncertainty, but the crackling fire and the soft weight of Snowy calmed her. She sat up, brushing hair behind her ear. Her hazel eyes still held fatigue, but there was something steadier now, something anchored. Jim walked inside, shaking snow off his parka. "Morning," he said. "We've got work to do." Hannah blinked, confused. "Work?" "Training," Jim clarified. "If the Sterlings are watching, they're not done. We prepare." She swallowed, but nodded. Her slender frame straightened slightly, a hint of resolve returning. After breakfast, simple eggs and toast, Jim led her outside. The trees stood tall like pillars around the clearing. Fresh snow crunched under their feet. "First lesson," Jim said, planting his boots firmly. "Awareness." Hannah tightened her coat, watching him. The cold reddened her cheeks and nose, but her expression was focused. "Most people walk with their eyes down. You keep yours up. Scan left to right, top to bottom. Look for anything that doesn't belong. Shapes, shadows, tracks." Hannah mimicked his slow head movement. "Like this?" "Better," Jim nodded. Rex trotted circles around them, occasionally stopping to sniff the wind. Snowy followed clumsily behind him, his little paws sinking into the powder. Jim reached down and touched a broken branch on the snow. "This wasn't like this yesterday." Hannah knelt beside him. "An animal? Maybe. Or someone testing the perimeter." Her breath caught, but Jim placed a calming hand on her shoulder. "That's the second lesson. Fear is information, not a command." For the next hour, Jim walked her through patterns of movement. How to walk quietly. How to identify natural sounds versus unnatural ones. How to breathe to steady her heartbeat. His voice was calm, instructional, almost gentle. But underneath every word was experience earned through years that had left scars she could not see. Hannah listened closely, eager to learn, her brows furrowed with concentration. She stumbled at times on the uneven terrain, but each time she rose faster. As the morning deepened, Jim brought her to the open area behind the cabin. A tree stump stood 20 yards away, an old tin can perched on top. "I'm not giving you a weapon," Jim said. "Not today. But I'll show you how recoil works." He handed her a wooden practice tool shaped like a pistol grip. She hesitated, looking uncertain. "Jim, I've never even held a real one." "Good," he said. "Means you don't have bad habits." He stepped behind her, adjusting her stance gently, knees bent, shoulders lower, weight forward. His hands were calloused but steady. "Lean into it. Don't let fear push you back." Hannah inhaled, exhaled, and pulled the wooden trigger. Even without the sound, the motion taught her something. Control. "You'll get there," Jim said. She turned and saw something in his eyes. Approval, maybe pride. It warmed her more than the fire inside ever could. As they trained, Rex suddenly lifted his head, ears stiff, body going rigid. Jim immediately raised a hand. "Freeze!" Snowy whined softly, sensing the shift. Rex stared into the forest, nose twitching. The tension lasted only a moment before he relaxed again. Jim gave a slow nod. "Good boy. That's why he's here." Hannah crouched and scratched Rex's fur. "He noticed something before you did?" "Always," Jim said. "That dog is a walking early warning system." Snowy barked happily, trying to imitate Rex's seriousness. Rex responded with a patient nudge, almost paternal. By afternoon, the sky dimmed again, signaling another wave of snow. Jim guided Hannah through the cabin's perimeter. He showed her the small motion-activated cameras he mounted on trees, concealed inside old birdhouses. Each one transmitted to his tablet inside. "These are military grade?" she asked. "Modified," he replied. "Good enough for what's coming." He strung thin fishing lines across likely approach paths. They weren't meant to injure, just to ring small bells inside the cabin, an early warning system. Hannah watched him work, memorizing everything. She admired his precision, the way he tested every knot twice, checked angles, calculated distances. Jim Walker wasn't just preparing a home, he was building a fortress. When they returned inside, the fire blazed strong. Snowy slept curled against Rex's stomach. The big dog didn't move, only opened his eyes now and then to check the room. Hannah sat at the table, staring into her tea. Jim noticed her quietness. "You did well today." She smiled faintly. "Thank you. I feel safer already." Jim nodded, but something weighed behind his gaze. Night approached, and with it came his battles. Later, when the cabin was quiet and Hannah slept in the guest room, Jim sat alone on the couch. The fire flickered shadows across his face. He leaned back, hoping sleep would come. But when his eyes closed, desert sand filled his mind. The sound of explosions, the sudden drop into silence, the faces of men he couldn't save. His breathing quickened, fists tightening until his knuckles turned white. He thrashed. Then suddenly a voice reached through the chaos. "Jim, you're here. It's the cabin. You're safe." Hannah knelt beside him, speaking softly, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. Her presence was warm, steady, an anchor. Slowly, painfully, the storm inside him quieted. Jim sat up, wiping sweat from his brow. "Sorry," he muttered. "You shouldn't see that." "You helped me when I was falling apart," Hannah whispered. "Let me help you too." Jim looked at her for a long moment. Something unspoken passed between them. Trust not born of romance, but survival. Rex approached, pressing his head against Jim's knee. Snowy wobbled beside him, looking confused but determined to participate. The moment softened the veteran's hardened expression. They sat together until Jim's breathing slowed. Outside, snow fell silently over the mountains. Inside, the cabin felt less like a hiding place, and more like a team forming. Jim glanced at the locked door, the reinforced windows, the tablet showing each camera feed. They were ready. At least they were getting there. And when the Sterlings came, and Jim knew they would, this time he would not be alone. The blizzard arrived long before midnight, swallowing the forest in a storm so violent that even the towering pines bowed under the weight of the wind. Snow came in horizontal waves, hammering the cabin walls like fists demanding entry. The windows shuddered from gusts that screamed through the mountains, and the temperature outside plummeted so sharply the air felt like shards of ice. Inside, the fire roared in the stone hearth, fighting back the storm's fury with flickering orange warmth. Jim Walker stood near the window, watching the darkness beyond the tree line. He wore only a thermal shirt and cargo pants, but his posture was rigid, alert. At 50, with a scar cutting along his jawline and the build of a man forged in conflict, Jim could read the weather like a battlefield. And tonight, something felt wrong. The storm wasn't the only thing approaching. Behind him, Hannah Ruiz cleaned up dishes from dinner. The 23-year-old moved slowly, still sore from the previous day's training, but her hands were steadier than before. Her dark chestnut hair was tied back, her pale skin flushed warm by the fire. Snowy, the 3-month-old gray-white puppy, slept in front of the hearth, while Rex, the 4-year-old German shepherd, paced the room, ears twitching, tail stiff, nose testing the shifting air. Jim glanced at him. "Rex knows before we do," he murmured. Hannah approached, rubbing her arms. "Is something out there?" Jim didn't answer. He listened, really listened. Years of combat taught him that danger didn't always announce itself with sound. Sometimes, it was the lack of sound. The forest outside had gone unnaturally still. No wind-shifting branches, no distant owl call, nothing but the storm's relentless howl. Jim killed the lights. The cabin fell into darkness except for the orange glow of the fireplace. Hannah froze. "Jim, quiet," he whispered. "They're here." Rex growled. A deep, low rumble, primal and dangerous. Snowy woke with a confused whimper and pressed against Hannah's legs. A sudden impact slammed into the front door. Wood splintered. A second blow followed, metal grinding against metal. The unmistakable clash of a crowbar hitting reinforced hinges. Jim's trap sensors didn't trigger because the attackers hadn't approached the usual paths. They were using the storm as cover, slipping in close enough to bypass the outer perimeter before hitting the door. Hannah backed away, clutching Snowy. "What do we do?" Jim grabbed her shoulder firmly but gently. "Bathroom, now, take Snowy, lock the door and stay low." His voice stayed low, even commanding. "If anyone gets through, Rex will find you." The doorframe cracked under a third strike. Hannah rushed to the bathroom at the back of the cabin. Rex followed her, growling steadily. Jim waited until she closed the door, then moved into position, ducking behind the kitchen wall. He picked up nothing but a heavy fireplace. Poker, not ideal, but silent. And he couldn't risk a gunshot with Hannah behind thin walls. The fourth blow shattered the lock. The door burst inward. 4 masked men in black snow gear stormed into the cabin, faces hidden behind balaclavas, each carrying a crowbar or baton. They moved with clumsy confidence instead of trained precision. The swagger of men who believed their money and connections made them untouchable. The storm's roar filled the cabin behind them, bringing snow and cold air swirling across the floor. "Find the girl!" the largest man barked, his voice thick and rough. He was built like a retired bouncer. Broad shoulders, thick arms, a scar running down his forearm, visible even under the gear. Jim moved before the intruders could spread out. He hit the breaker. Total darkness swallowed the cabin. "Lights! Where's the—" one of the men shouted. A flashlight beam flickered on, but too late. Jim struck from the shadows, silent as a ghost. The fireplace poker cracked into the first man's ribs with a sickening thud. He collapsed instantly, gasping for air. Before he could recover, Jim swept his legs out from under him and slammed him into the floor. A second man spun, sweeping his flashlight wildly. Jim lunged, grabbed his wrist, twisted sharply until bone snapped with a wet crack, and forced him to the ground with a strike to the throat. Not lethal, but enough to silence him. The third man panicked. "Where is he? Where the hell is he?" Jim stepped behind him and delivered a precise elbow strike to the base of the skull. The man dropped like dead weight. The largest man swung his crowbar blindly. "Come out and fight, you coward!" Jim's voice cut through the storm. "I'm right here." The huge attacker pivoted toward the sound, and Jim charged, slipping inside the arc of the swing. He delivered a brutal palm strike into the man's jaw, then slammed his shoulder into the man's center of gravity, flipping him over the broken coffee table. Wood exploded beneath the man's weight. Jim moved fast, tying each intruder's wrists with heavy-duty zip ties. He kept ready behind the couch. He flipped the breaker back on. Light returned, revealing 4 men groaning on the floor. But the cabin wasn't safe yet. From the back of the hallway came a crash. The bathroom doorframe splintered. Hannah screamed. Jim sprinted. Inside the narrow bathroom, a masked man, smaller than the others, wiry, with a snake tattoo curling up his neck, had forced his way in. He reached for Hannah, who shielded Snowy with her body. Rex exploded into the room like a missile. The German shepherd clamped his jaws onto the man's forearm. The attacker shrieked, dropping his weapon, a steel flashlight that clattered onto the tiles. Rex bit harder, teeth sinking through fabric. The man thrashed, smashing Rex into the wall. The dog yelped but refused to let go. Hannah saw her chance. She grabbed the ceramic lid of the toilet, tank, heavy, solid, and swung it down on the man's shoulder with every ounce of strength she had. The crack echoed through the cabin. The attacker collapsed, Rex still holding his arm. Jim burst into the bathroom, Hannah shaking but alive, whispered, "Rex saved me. He saved me." Jim knelt, checked Rex's condition, then hauled the intruder by the collar back to the living room and zip-tied him with the others. The cabin was a mess. Shattered wood, footprints, blood, snow covering the floor. But everyone inside was alive. And now Jim had leverage. Hours passed. Dawn finally arrived, gray, exhausted light filtering through storm clouds. Snow had piled knee-deep outside. The forest was silent again. Sheriff Daniels arrived with 2 deputies. Daniels was a man in his early 60s, tall with salt-and-pepper hair and a tired but steady face. Deep lines across his forehead hinted at years of dealing with problems the wealthy families of Northbridge tried to hide. He wore a thick brown jacket lined with fur and had a skeptical but intelligent gaze. Upon stepping into the cabin, he froze at the sight. 5 masked attackers tied in a row on the floor. "Jim, what the hell happened here?" Jim handed the sheriff a tablet containing the recorded audio and 4K footage from the birdhouse cameras outside. Daniels watched the clips, tracking the men approaching, their voices mentioning Sterling's orders and their attempts to break in. The sheriff's expression hardened. "Those idiots really thought the snowstorm would bury this." "It didn't," Jim said. Daniels sighed heavily, then turned to his deputies. "Cuff them, all of them, and call for transport. Get a warrant ready for the Sterlings." One deputy asked, "Even the father?" "Especially the father," Daniels replied. By the time the sun finally rose over Northbridge, the Sterling family's empire began to crumble. As the attackers were loaded into vehicles, Daniels shook Jim's hand firmly. "You saved lives tonight, Jim, and you exposed a family that's been poisoning this town for too long." Jim gave a single nod. "Just did what had to be done." Rex sat proudly beside him, chest puffed out. Snowy leaned against Hannah's boots, still trembling slightly from the night, but safe. The storm had passed, but the war had turned. Long time, the world felt survivable. Winter lingered for another 3 weeks over Northbridge, but something in the town began to thaw long before the ice melted. News of the Sterling raid spread faster than wind through pine branches. Every resident, from shopkeepers along Main Street to the elderly men who gathered each morning outside the old hardware store, heard what had happened in the mountains during the blizzard. Heard how a group of masked attackers had broken into a veteran's cabin, how Sheriff Daniels had found overwhelming evidence of their involvement, and how Jim Walker, a 50-year-old former soldier with a weathered jawline and cold blue eyes, had protected not only himself, but a young woman and her puppy. The Sterling family had dominated Northbridge politics for more than a decade, but corruption rots quickly when light hits it. Richard Sterling, once the polished, broad-shouldered mayoral candidate with iron-gray hair and a permanent smile that never touched his steely eyes, lost the election within 48 hours after the arrest. His downfall was swift and public. News clips looping security camera footage, leaked audio of his hired men discussing plans, and interviews with townsfolk who had long suspected his generosity masked something darker. Hannah Ruiz watched all of it unfold from the small living room of Dr. Tom's veterinary clinic. She sat on the worn blue couch in the lobby, Snowy curled on her lap, now fully healed and lively, his gray-white fur fluffed out like a little snowball. Rex lay near the door, paws neatly crossed, tracking every sound that came from outside. Jim stood against the wall with quiet familiarity, hands in the pockets of his parka, his expression unreadable. The clinic had always been a comforting place. Small, full of warm light, with walls covered in framed photos of Dr. Tom holding recovered animals. Dr. Tom, a short, round-faced man in his early 50s with sandy blonde hair thinning at the top, wore a forest green scrub top under a heavy cardigan. His soft blue eyes radiated warmth, the kind that made nervous pets immediately relax. He stepped out from the examination room, wiping his hands on a towel. "Hannah?" he said with a gentle smile. "Got a minute?" Hannah set Snowy down. Her heart thumped. "Of course." Dr. Tom sat beside her on the couch, leaning forward with elbows on his knees. "You've been helping me for weeks now. Long hours, hard work. You've stayed calm through chaos most people wouldn't survive." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "I want you here full-time. Assistant position, salary, benefits, the works." Hannah's breath caught. Tears welled behind her hazel eyes. Her slender shoulders trembled in disbelief. "Dr. Tom, I don't know what to say." "Say yes," he replied softly. "You're good at this. Really good." Snowy barked happily, as if deciding for her. Hannah laughed, wiping a tear. "Yes. Absolutely yes." Jim gave a subtle nod, approving but staying in the background, the way he always did when happiness finally found someone else. Rex gave a proud snort. Dr. Tom clapped his hands together. "Good. Start tomorrow, and Snowy can be our unofficial mascot." Snowy pranced circles around Rex, who endured the chaos with patient authority. Spring approached slowly, but the town felt brighter each day. Richard Sterling's influence vanished like frost under the sun. Clarkson, the sanitation supervisor who had fired Hannah unjustly, resigned once his ties to the Sterlings became public. The city quietly reinstated Hannah's old job, but she no longer needed it. She had found something better. Purpose. For Jim Walker and Rex, life returned to its familiar rhythm on the mountain. The cabin, once a fortress under siege, now felt peaceful again. Jim repaired the door, reinforced the windows, and cleared away broken wood. Snow buried the scars of the attack, and new animal tracks appeared near the tree line, signaling that the forest was reclaiming what had been disturbed. Some nights, Hannah hiked up the trail after her shift, her boots sinking into soft snow. She brought simple meals: homemade stew, fresh bread, occasionally a pie gifted by a grateful townsperson. Her slender frame moved lightly through the woods, her breath forming clouds as she approached the warm glow of the cabin windows. Inside, she helped Jim repair fences that deer had knocked over or sorted tools in the small shed beside the cabin. She enjoyed the quiet conversations with him. Talk of weather patterns, memories of growing up in Northbridge, or the funny quirks of pets at the clinic. Jim listened more than he spoke, but something in his demeanor softened when she visited. Snowy became a second shadow to Rex. The young pup followed Rex everywhere, into the trees, across the yard, even attempting the same patrol routes. Rex tolerated it with dignified patience, occasionally nudging Snowy back when the pup wandered too far. They played in wide circles behind the clinic each afternoon, kicking up puffs of snow as they chased one another. In town, people began recognizing Hannah not as the girl who had been bullied on the roadside, but as the assistant at the vet clinic, who always had a kind smile and a steady hand. Children brought injured birds to her, and farmers asked for her help with lambs and calves. She belonged now, not because someone allowed her to, but because she earned it. Jim and Rex never moved into town. They remained guardians of the quiet mountains, living simply in their cabin, hiking the trails Jim knew by memory, repairing equipment, keeping watch in the way only a battle-hardened veteran truly could. But they were no longer alone. When snow fell, light, drifting flakes that turned the forest white, someone always arrived at the cabin door. Sometimes it was Hannah with soup. Sometimes it was Snowy with a stolen mitten. Sometimes it was all four of them walking the ridge together, their breaths steaming in rhythm, their footprints weaving through the pines. They were not a family, but they had become something just as rare. People who held on to one another during the coldest winter of their lives. And in the quiet that followed the storm, Northbridge changed too. The town began to feel safer, kinder, as if the courage of one man, one woman, and two loyal dogs had pushed the darkness out into the wilderness where it belonged. Even when life is harsh, God never abandons anyone. When Hannah was humiliated in the freezing winter and every door seemed to close, he sent Jim and Rex at the exact moment she needed help. A quiet miracle in the middle of the storm. No blinding light from heaven, no thunder from the sky, just the appearance of someone brave enough to do what's right. In our everyday lives, we all have moments when we feel as lost as Hannah, but if we keep kindness and faith in our hearts, God will place the right person in the right moment. Sometimes a miracle is simply a hand reaching out when we're falling. If this story touched you, please share it, leave a comment, like the video, and subscribe to support more stories of hope. May God bless and protect everyone watching this. Amen.